here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer John Aizlewood, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and that other one, poetry. Also, he brought a book out a couple of years ago titled Joy Division, New Order, Decades, available from all good bookshops and online. Fantastic publication, do check it out, and all his other books. I will put a link in the notes below. But anyway, this is the interview, so you're going to hear everything you need to know and much more in this fascinating interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the reason for the project, which is fascinating. So do take notes. I will test you at the end. John, tell us about your amazing project to bring this book together.
Well, in a sense, Joy Division has always been a band I wanted to write about because I saw them. I was too young to interview them or anything like that. And I interviewed New Order in their early days. And I'd sort of followed the ups and downs of their career. But I thought that this story had never really been told, or not properly anyway, because it's New Order and Joy Division. They're a band who almost everyone's had a go at writing the book. You know, the bassist's written 2 books, the drummer has written 2 books, the singer of New Order has written a book, the singer of Joy Division's wife has written a book, but no one has ever brought this whole tale together. And because they're all such extraordinary people, and because they're all such flawed people, then the tale has been told, but it's been told in this kind of partisan way. But I thought that I could bring the whole package together and present a reasonably unbiased point of view. Now, of course, unbiased doesn't have to mean boring, although it can. It does mean that this is such a fascinating tale in itself. Now, you have tragedy, there's death, you have this fantastic music, you have these almost Faustian bargains that they made to achieve and to become famous. You have relationships, schoolboy friendships crumbling in great animosity. There's almost everything there. But for me also, there was a time factor too, in that I did most of it in the first lockdown.
Right.
During the first lockdown, and of course my whole professional world virtually collapsed, and I was stuck at home with my family. They've heard all my jokes, you know, they're sick of me. They don't want to be cooped up with me 24 hours a day. So from a family point of view, it was beneficial that I should get myself into a car, drive on my own to a socially distanced place, sit in the car on my own, and write a book 4 or 5 afternoons a week. It was a very, very healthy thing to do for me. So practically, it was a book that has mostly been written in the front seat of a car.
My God, that is amazing. I did not expect that to happen or hear that. I've never heard that story before. Well, like that. I came across a writer once who, when he was finishing his piece, would go to a hotel and just kind of focus for another week or 2. But that was kind of at the end, but not kind of during the whole process and not in a car. You must have a comfortable car with a good battery.
Yeah, no, I've got quite a small Fiesta, but the driver's seat, you can wind it back. I could prop the laptop on the steering wheel. I knew the angle of the sun so that the sun wouldn't shine to me depending on what time of the afternoon and where I was sitting. And I was away 3 or 4 hours. I could listen to music at the same time, which of course was excellent because I know obviously for months and months and months the only music I was listening to was New Order and Joy Division. So yes. I could listen to that whilst writing it. I could, obviously, I love my children to bits, but I could be without them. They're not particularly interested in Joy Division or New Order for some strange reason. So there was no distraction.
Yes.
And I was there. So it very much helped preserve family life during lockdown. And it was something to do. But that sounds too casual, you know. It was a project that I was absolutely obsessed about.
Yes. Well, I think it's interesting. I think everyone needed to try and get focused. And it did remind me of a story that I did of an author who's going through the 1970s of David Bowie and every day would go to his room, and for that particular, I don't know, year, not quite a year, would be in 1970 or 1971. The book is behind me, but I won't look. But I can't remember who the author is. It's on Omnibus. Oh, it's up there. Anyway, so did you, with that experience, did you also, in your Ford Fiesta 1.1, probably 1.3, did you also sort of immerse yourself in Manchester and that period of sort of the beginning of Thatcher's Britain and sort of...
I immersed myself in Salford in particular, because Salford fashioned the individual members of Joy Division. It fashioned too, I think, the sound of Joy Division and that environment that even in the early 70s, when Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook grew up, there was still the legacy of the 19th century cotton era in Manchester, as well as the war. It was still an old cotton town, but it was in the 70s. It was a desolate place. There were areas of it, particularly in Salford, where those two grew up, that were almost like a moonscape, you know. And the music that they created, I think, painted an oral picture of that sort of post-industrial lunarscape. It was very, very Mancunian. It was very, very futuristic. And of course, Martin Hannett, the producer of the Joy Division material, he had a lot to do with fashioning that sound. But the environs of Salford certainly helped shape them. And later on with New Order, then in the Sorry saga of the Hacienda nightclub, which they invested in, then that too, I think, affected them somewhat. The New Order are much more of an international band. That's because, of course, they've been going for so much longer. They've sold records abroad. Joy Division never had the chance to be anything other than a Manchester band. Now, in terms of listening to music from the scene, Manchester was a bit of a punk wasteland. You know, there's only really Slaughter and the Dogs, who the people around them. Rob Gretton, who was one of their roadies, he was obviously New Order and Joy Division's manager. But I think the sound of the contemporary sound of Manchester didn't really influence Joy Division in that way. So I think if you're listening to Sad Cafe or if you're listening to Slaughter and the Dogs, then I don't think that would necessarily benefit any deeper investigation of Joy Division or New Order. And then later, bands did follow in Joy Division's wake, a lot of bands on Factory. And I think to an extent, I tried to stay clear of it to a bit, because I didn't want to link either band to a movement. Because, of course, they drew from all sorts of areas. I'm not suggesting they're wildly unique, although they are. But they drew from so many different areas that I think listening to music around them, even listening to krautrock to understand some of Ian Curtis's musical obsessions and some of the early New Order electro, or listening to Chicago house, or more particularly New York house, then yes, they're all staging points. And I think it's important to be familiar with the work of, say, Arthur Baker, who worked with New Order. But I think bands generally, great bands, tend to stand alone. And I think it's important to reflect that.
Yes. I do remember when John Peel was talking about another Manchester band who came a few years later, the Smiths. I suppose he said, he was kind of curious because he's sort of, you would hear, and obviously with John Peel, that was his full-time job. He could sort of go, oh, yes, they've been listening to this, this and this, and almost take away the magic of that band. But with some bands, you just couldn't work out what the members had actually been influenced by and what they had slightly copied and then made their own sound, or in some cases not made their own sound at all. And I suppose Joy Division was very much like that. But also, having been to that exhibition, we saw the famous-ish letter from Ian Curtis ranting about the album itself, which is always a bit of a surprise when I know Stephen, the drummer, had sort of was disappointed when they heard it, but I hadn't seen or read that letter that Ian had written to say how horrified he'd been by what they had done to his music, which is quite interesting in itself, because I don't know if many bands I've ever come across that before. And then it's such an iconic sound and we all love it.
Well, I think a lot of bands are quite disappointed when they hear the finished product, because it's never what they heard in their head when they were writing these songs, and it's not really how they saw themselves on stage. Now, Martin Hannett always regarded Joy Division as being one genius and three blokes, And he's very, very nurturing of Ian's talent. And certainly when Unknown Pleasures came out, both Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner were very disappointed in it because they saw themselves as rather more traditional than Martin Hannett did.
Right.
And they railed against the magic, the fairy dust that he'd sprinkled on their efforts. They'd sort of indulged him when he got them to record their drums in a lift shaft, when he recorded the sound of breaking glass, and he recorded various radiators in the studio and things like that. But they didn't think that they were producing something that would be so otherworldly. You know, Peter Hook was a straightforward rock fan. You know, and yes, it's true. Bernard Sumner would never have seen Wishbone Ash, for example, had not Peter Hook dragged him along to a Wishbone Ash concert. And although, of course, Bernard never saw Joy Division as being Wishbone Ash, he did see them as being a more bog standard indie band. And Ian Curtis too. He was the first to come round, I think, to the brilliance of Unknown Pleasures and to what Martin Hannett had done. And when they recorded the second album, of course, the album which Ian Curtis would never hear, then in a sense, they tended to split into factions. I mean, Ian's personal life was in turmoil and Martin Hannett was taking an awful lot of drugs, but it was the two of them pushing Joy Division forward in a way which at the time was certainly beyond Peter Hook's imagination. And Bernard Sumner would eventually come round to pushing the musical envelope out further. And of course, now they're both quite open about not liking Unknown Pleasures at first, and to a lesser extent, Closer when it came out. But they for whatever reason, they both admit that they were terribly wrong to have made that judgment. And of course, Ian Curtis sending the letter saying how distressed he was about how Joy Division sounded. He was very impetuous. He was that sort of guy. He was the sort of guy who would rant and rave at you. He was the sort of guy who literally grabbed Tony Wilson by the collars and with an awful lot of swearing in, essentially said, why on earth don't you put Joy Division on your television programme? And he called him all sorts of names for not doing so. And I don't think Tony Wilson, you know, he was a posh boy, he'd been Oxbridge educated. I don't think anyone had ever spoken to him like that before, than this oik, this super intense oik coming up to him and saying, get our band on.
Yes.
And, you know, one of the few things that Tony Wilson did right was to spot Joy Division and to back them. And he did, of course, put them on television. But that's who Ian Curtis was. He had a temper. He could fly off the handle. But he was also, I think, someone who came round to see the bigger picture in almost everything very, very quickly. He was on a quest for artistic knowledge, not just musical knowledge, but for literature, for art, for cinema too. And he was someone who was on a journey, and that journey really commenced when he started out being the singer in a band.
Yes. And were you sort of amazed at his lyrical depth at such a young age? You know, when you sort of read the words that he wrote and the depth of kind of emotion that he'd gone to. I mean, occasionally sort of Morrissey reached some of those moments in the 80s. But, you know, with Joy Division, you know, they are quite kind of frighteningly deep, aren't they? And they're not tripe. You know, when I listen to some of the current singer-songwriters, you know, it's a bit like, you know, they're nice words, but there's no kind of real emotion or depth or pain underneath them. They obviously, you know, they've written it, strummed away on the guitar, and they'll sell a few billion records. But the Ian Curtis lyric is just kind of like, I find it hard to listen to now. You know, when I was younger, I loved it because I just wanted to bathe in that sort of romantic melancholia. But now it's just a bit too painful, actually.
I mean, I think the thing with Ian Curtis's lyrics, and I think he was a poet of incredibly great depth, is that he meant it. And I know that sounds really trite, but you can, if you were to read the lyrics of particularly Closer as some sort of suicide note, then I don't think you would be too far wrong. He moved in to the dark arts, to the black depths of the soul, and almost everything that he wrote for Joy Division was about him. And it was this state of intense despair. You know, he'd read Louis Ferdinand Celine, obviously, and he'd seen a lot of the darker German films. And I think they influenced him too. But he was writing about himself almost overwhelmingly. And I think it must have been almost too much for him to bear. Because the people who you can compare him, but I think he's far, far superior to Morrissey in every aspect. But the things who you really can compare him with, people such as Leonard Cohen, then they too have known the darkness of despair. But Ian, I think, was someone who in the end, not in a real poetic sense, he wasn't a particularly poetic man, you know. He had a farty sense of humour. He laughed out loud. He was a belly laughs kind of guy a lot of the time. But he was also a very troubled man too. And I think those lyrics are a guide to what he was thinking for some of the time, not all of it by any means. And that some of those thoughts expressed in some of the songs on Closer were an explanation of why he killed himself.
Yes, and one of the other points that sort of, I suppose, comes up from that sort of period and the two cities of Manchester and Liverpool. And I know a few years ago, Cherry Red Records brought out these two compilations where there was a 7 CD box set of Manchester and there was a 5 CD box set of Liverpool. Was there much kind of rivalry between the two kind of cities? Because obviously Liverpool had Eric's, which was this kind of like the nightclub that all the cool people went to, and they all formed bands and then went and mushroomed even more. And Manchester, obviously, you were saying that didn't have quite that sort of musical legacy at that point, but then sort of in the 80s, it really does kind of get ignited. I mean, was there a sense of sort of, a certain, city rivalry between the two places?
No, there wasn't. And there wasn't for a particular reason. I mean, the sense of rivalry between Manchester and Liverpool has been exacerbated over the last few years, particularly by football. But in terms of music, that wasn't there because there wasn't any comparison to make. You know, Liverpool had this fantastic, fabulous musical history with the Beatles, the whole host of Merseybeat, and also it cottoned on to punk and new wave. You had great bands like the Yachts, you know, you had people like the Crucial Three, you had this thriving scene. Manchester bands had nothing to give them any kind of traction. You had Peter Noone, who was sold a lot of records in America, so therefore we must respect him. But he was still a very lightweight kind of pop star, so there's no history. There was nothing to have a rivalry with. And when bands did come through, such as Joy Division, and maybe you can compare them with perhaps Echo and the Bunnymen or the Teardrop Explodes, then they were they're all egotistical, they're all different, they're all fiercely ambitious, but in a sense they were kindred spirits.
Yes.
And it was not. There was a bit of matiness, particularly between the Bunnymen and New Order a little bit later on. But there wasn't that we're from Manchester rivalry or we're from Liverpool. It didn't really operate like that in a musical sense. You know, Joy Division played Liverpool quite a lot, and they never had any troubles there.
No.
And obviously, when New Order got really big, they played the national circuit, and Liverpool obviously part of that. And they were too big to transcend any rivalry. But some of the early New Order concerts were in Liverpool too, and there was no hassle, there was no trouble. Teardrop Explodes played Manchester a lot, and you have bands such as Oasis who played, particularly in their early days, they played the Mancunian card, but that was sort of football related. And that's where that rivalry came from. It wasn't there musically in the time that Joy Division were breaking through.
Yes, I suppose there was then the Hacienda and the Manchester scene, which is the rave, which was about 10 years afterwards. Did you, when doing the book, you know, there's the kind of the horrendous death of Ian, which is quite sort of horrendous, really. I mean, sort of researching it and then looking at it, what's it like as a writer when you're trying to sort of piece together that period where they start to, decide to keep the band together and then sort of call themselves New Order, get another keyboard player in, do a bit of a shuffle? I mean, is it tricky looking at it, trying to sort of get into the idea of what they must have been going through at that time with hindsight of like, oh yes, of course, that's quite straightforward, because not many bands would have done what they went on to do, let alone sort of then become incredibly successful and then sort of capture their own sound. Because there must have been a real strange transition period with the bands, as well as kind of wondering, well, what's the point? We're just, we were just about to make it and it's kind of being kicked from under our legs.
Well, their behaviour when Ian Curtis died was bizarre in the extreme. They sort of knew something was up. They knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know that he was going to do what he did that particular weekend. Bernard went off water skiing with another Manchester band, and Peter Hook was just at home with his watch. And then, when Peter Hook got the call, he was having his Sunday lunch, and he received the call, put the phone down, carried on eating. And then several hours later, his wife said to him, "Who's that on the phone?" And he goes, "Well, Ian's dead." And it sounds incredibly callous. And even at the funeral, the wake was this sort of, it was a showing with everybody was drunk. And it was a showing of the great rock and roll swindle with all these people. And I think they were so emotionally stunted. They didn't have the social skills to deal with this overwhelming thing that had happened to them. And now that they're so much older now, obviously they regret how they behaved, and they understand, particularly Peter Hook, that it would have been much better for their mental health had they taken 6 months off. But they had this horrible sounding wake on late one week, and then the next week they were back in the studio working. And even though they'd lost the lyricist, and they'd never bothered to read his lyrics, lest we forget, they'd lost their lyricist and their singer, there was no question that they wouldn't continue. And it sounds so hard. And they were emotionally hard people too, but they just didn't know what to deal with it. And they didn't have anything else to do. They'd had the rubbish jobs. They'd had the mundane clerical jobs. And they were about to break America. They were literally days away from flying to their first American dates when Ian killed himself. Something was happening. They weren't a hopeless case. And this meant, too, that initially they'd no idea how to progress. So they just carried on as Joy Division. They called themselves another name, New Order, of course, but they made an album which was like a poor quality Joy Division album. Yes. And they didn't have a singer. They didn't have great lyrics. They never bothered about lyrics on before. And they had to write them on Movement. Then it wasn't this. They didn't have the capacity to bare their souls. So it wasn't this cathartic tribute to Ian. It was a band sounding like a Joy Division copyist band. And very, very quickly, to their credit, they realised that they couldn't go on like this. They would just be sub-Joy Division for the rest of their lives. So then, led by Bernard, then they made assorted musical sea changes, which took them away. And after Movement, there are very few New Order songs which anybody could rationally suggest came from the Joy Division stable. They became their own men, and they did that consciously too. It's because, and I think it was the only way that they could shed Ian's overwhelming legacy. The guy had died. Joy Division's catalogue is preserved in aspic forever. It's a slender, small catalogue. It's almost Tamiya's and many more, I think. It's almost perfect. And New Order were overwhelmed by it once they started. So they had to move away. And this meant not playing Joy Division songs for years and years. It meant speaking about Ian, but only in this kind of gruff northern way. I remember as a student trying to talk to them about it. Obviously I wasn't particularly great as an interviewer in those days. Maybe I'm still not. But they used to say, yeah, he had this raincoat, the raincoat that we've seen in the famous photos. There's photos of it in my book, Decades. Yes. And they said, oh, God, it's horrible. We hated that coat. And, and they wanted to play up him not being this permanently serious person all the time, which he wasn't. And they go to America, they'd start selling records, and no one would ask them about Ian Curtis. The Americans, of course, were not through any fault of their own, but they were unfamiliar with Joy Division. It's only sort of much later that the Americans have but have actually discovered Joy Division.
Yes, I know. They said we love to go back. It's 40 years ago. Because in a way, I mean, sort of looking at the 80s, which is the decade that I seem to sort of love so much, there was a real sort of period between 83 to 87 where indie pop sort of really becomes a thing. There's the punk. This is really simplistic, by the way, punk, post-punk. And, there was all those other tribes and subsections, but then sort of the Smiths come along, and there is that feeling that is this a new chapter that's going to be there whether you like it or not. And obviously you had the mainstream charts and that Trevor Horn production sound. So sort of for that kind of 5 years where the Smiths are 24/7 and everything, the NME sort of gravitates, everything's kind of going towards them. There's a sort of real moment when they break up and that world of ecstasy hits, and then the dance scene. But Joy Division, interestingly, it was kind of, was it 85 when they brought out Low Life, and then the sort of the great single, The Perfect Kiss, appears. I mean, I suppose they also had Blue Monday as well. But that album seems to be the one that they get that little bit more confidence and they start working with video and visual art more. And it does seem to be that period where, as a band, you feel like they've definitely found the blueprint of what they're going to become for the next 5 or 6 years, isn't it?
I think that there's certainly something in that. I think Low Life was the moment they realised that, one, they were selling a lot of records worldwide. And this is what every band wants to do. Those who tell you differently aren't telling the truth, or they should just be recording it in their bedrooms, not playing the music to anyone. The New Order was selling a lot of records, and they were also, we mustn't forget this, they were really enjoying selling a lot of records. They were really enjoying being pop stars. They were really embracing that life. And they built it themselves. They'd shaken off Ian Curtis's legacy. They made Low Life, which for the most part it's a very joyous album. It's a danceable album, not a dance album, but a danceable album. And it sounds like a band who are selling a lot of records. It sounds like a rock star's record.
Yes.
And there is that moment, it's that honeymoon period where bands start selling records and they start enjoying it. Now, things happen further on the line, as of course they would and did with New Order, or bands suddenly stopped selling records for whatever reason. At that point, and it was late in their lives, and there's an argument that they should have been a lot more capable of dealing with it than they were, because it was so many albums into their own careers, if you include the Joy Division albums, which you must, of course. So they were coming at it from an older perspective than most bands who break through internationally. And Substance, the compilation, is the one that took them into the American arena circuit. But they really enjoyed themselves. Any sense of guilt, not necessarily about Ian, but any sense of indie guilt had long gone. They loved being pop stars.
Yes, well, I sort of remember seeing them on the next period of their life, which was Technique, which was the kind of the most sunny album they've ever done in their life. I think, I must admit, I'm not that familiar with their later albums, so that's a bit of a sweeping statement. But Technique, when you put that on, and then got to the sort of the last song on side 2, it was just bathed in ecstasy and sunshine, wasn't it? And then they were touring arenas, because that was when I saw them at the NEC with the Happy Mondays supporting them. And they were obviously loving the lifestyle of being rock gods at that stage, weren't they? And they started to, go into, I don't know, Glastonbury Festival and such like. So that particular album, they do keep going almost one better, and it's kind of the album which they do in the 90s, which is, it feels a bit tired and a bit sort of, well, there's nothing new here, and that's been a bit of an anticlimax, really, isn't it? That was Republic. That was the album, which was kind of very disappointing. But Technique is perfect, isn't it? Would you say Technique is the perfect New Order album?
No. I like it, that's a hard question. The kind of the favourites and least favourites, they change. You know, it's like the New Order's catalogue is so vast that yes, you have to you can go into Technique and dip into it. I think what you said is right. You know, it was their first British number one album, and it did propel them into further. It cemented their arena status that they built up towards, and it showed that they were going to be an arena act for a considerable amount of time. And as you hinted, it's an album full of sunshine because of where it was recorded. It was recorded in Mallorca, and because of how it was recorded under the influence of industrial quantities of drugs. And the atmosphere between the group, it was beginning to fall apart. You know, Peter Hook was beginning to feel that he was getting edged out by this dance direction in a way that he hadn't before. You know, he'd never really been a dance maven, but I think he suddenly found himself in this position where he felt slightly emasculated, and that really sowed the seeds of the great split that was to come. But in terms of embracing the zeitgeist, then Technique was absolutely there. It's arguably the best, most coherent, for all the incoherencies involved in its recording, the best, most coherent way in which you can understand the British dance boom. And of course, in the end, they recorded so little of what they did in Mallorca was worth using. They had to come back and do it in Britain. But of course, that's another story. But even so, the sunshine of the Balearic Islands and the drug culture, it absolutely fueled them. They brought that back. They brought those things back with them to Britain.
Yes, lyrically, it was up there with. I don't know. I mean, it wasn't deep poetry, was it? Really, it was more sort of just kind of nice rhyming words, wasn't it? That made you feel kind of sunny and could sing along when you're kind of a little bit stoned, I guess, or something like that.
I think so. Yes. I mean, Bernard isn't. But in fairness to Bernard, he's never made a great play of his lyrics. You know, there's the occasional story song in there, and there's a lot of trite lyrics, but he's never pretended to be Ian Curtis. And I think also that in a sense that's one of New Order's strengths, because if you had a lyricist who was carrying on in the same vein as Ian Curtis, irrespective of what musical changes they were making, then I think there would be a lesser, more derivative band. And because you have Bernard's, as you put it, sort of silly words rhyming, then I think that does make it, bizarrely, makes them a stronger band, and it makes them less enthralled to Ian Curtis's legacy. And it also just keeps undermining the notion that they are not an indie band, that they escaped the indie ghetto a long time ago. And they did this very early on when, ironically, they were literally an indie band.
Yes.
But if you listen to songs like Confusion or Blue Monday on Factory, those early hits, they don't sound like an indie act.
No, they definitely weren't there with the Wolfhounds or the June Brides or Stump, Bogshed. No, none of those. But look, over Christmas, we all probably went and subscribed to Disney and watched the Beatles film, didn't we, for 8 hours, and we were quite enthralled. And one of the great mysteries that we'd all thought, it was a bit like Scooby-Doo, that, you know, who was responsible for the breakup of the Beatles, and we all thought it was Yoko. And it all turns out to be Alan Klein, the manager, instead. And we just went, oh, that was amazing. The great mystery of the breakup of the Beatles. What was the kind of the seeds problems that New Order had in the great sort of, it's never a mystery, well, it is a mystery, but it's always going to come, isn't it? The great sort of problem with a band. And obviously I mentioned the Smiths, who have it well documented. What's the kind of, when you look at the New Order story, where does it start to sort of fall apart where does the first crack start to appear? And then how does it sort of continue its kind of merry path until it all gets even worse?
Well, I mean, the split was between Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook. They'd been friends since primary school in Salford. So it really is a tragic tale that it's ended. Oh, if I'm not sure if ended is the right word, although if it is currently in such a rotten state. And the seeds of it were both with two words. They were personal and musical. Musically, as I hinted before, Peter Hook felt emasculated by the overt dance direction. He felt that he'd always been New Order's indie, for want of a better word, musical conscience, that he was the one who kept it anchored in a vague rock bassist. You know, he saw himself as a traditional bassist, who could also, as it happens, deliver some great dance bass lines as well. But he felt that he was getting pushed out of New Order musically, that his contributions weren't used enough, that there wasn't enough of his bass on New Order material, particularly after, including and after Technique. He'd enjoyed being a rock star. He enjoyed it more than any of them. But that was also part of the other factor too, because by his own admission, as the personality clash exploded, then he was heavily into drugs and drink. And this didn't make it easy for anyone. He admits now that it was something of a nightmare. And he must have been absolutely impossible to deal with.
Yes.
And he went into rehab. He worked a lot doing DJ sets with Bernard in this period when their relationship is crumbling. And although New Order have matured emotionally from where they were when, say, Ian died, then they're not kind of arms around the shoulder, huggy type guys. And I think too that Bernard musically wanted to keep moving away from Joy Division, but also from New Order's early work too. He wanted to be not so much the keeper of the catalogue, as I think Peter Hook wants to be, and now he obviously still is.
Yes.
He wanted to New Order to be this pushing, thrusting band who changed musically, and he wanted to do it from the studio. Peter Hook wanted to play live all the time. He was a road monster. He loved being on the road. And yes. He loved all the temptations that went with it. He loved the actual gigs because, bizarrely, from the point of view of someone as insecure as he was, that's where he was a major part of the band again on stage. He looked great. Of course he looked great. He was a Lancashire Viking who looked brilliant on stage. And he loved, so the lifestyle, the concerts, everything about him. Whereas Bernard, much more of a homeboy, he'd grown out of touring. And that too created enormous friction because Bernard wanted to work in the studio, Peter less keen to work in the studio, although wanted to fight his corner. And I think that there'd been for decades a point where they'd brought out the best in each other.
Yes.
For example, Peter taking Bernard, the very young Bernard, to see Wishbone Ash and Deep Purple. And Bernard repaid the favour in other areas, introducing him to reggae and dance and things like that. You know, but they were incredibly unsophisticated people. They grew up together. They never had pizza before they went to America. They didn't know what this weird stuff was on this glorified bread. They'd never done that. They'd never been there. They grew up together, and then they grew apart. And then they started noticing each other's differences. And Bernard, of course, was no innocent on the drugs and drink side of it. But he wasn't as overt as Peter. Peter Hook, heart on sleeve. You see what you get. Bernard, much more, I think, passive, someone who views the long term more, and someone who plans, I think, much more than Peter does. Peter seems to live in the moment, or particularly he did at that time. And that annoyed each other, those different sides of it, the different aspects. And where once they were a team, then suddenly they weren't. They were different factions. And it's it's incredibly sad, I think, even now. There's every few months something comes up, and it's never something that reconciles them. It's something that pushes them further apart. The other week they were signing loads of posters for charity, except they weren't. Peter Hook wasn't invited to sign these New Order posters from sometime reflecting the past catalogue. He wasn't part of it. The new guys, Phil and Tom, who've of course been there for well over a decade. So it's patronising to them to call them the new boys. But they have sort of reclaimed the catalogue and that idea of New Order going forward.
So what's that period like when they've done their album, which is titled No, this Waiting for the Siren's Call. This is the last time that Peter's kind of part of the band. This is 2005, isn't it? Their last time they're in the recording studio. And then after that, there's a kind of a massive break, and then they come back together, but without Peter Hook. How do they manoeuvre that period of the next album that Peter's not sort of invited along? Or has he by then been told he's no longer part of the band?
Well, he was told he wasn't part of the band because, in effect, they couldn't work with him. The financial settlement was extremely complicated and long-lasting, and everybody's still feeling the repercussions of that today. But I think Peter didn't quite know what to do. He still feels very, very uncomfortable about the way in which he was dismissed from the band. And I think Bernard was just sick of him, really. And he thought that he knew he had Stephen Morris, the drummer who'd been in Joy Division, and Gillian Gilbert, Stephen's partner, who has also took extended periods out of New Order to raise their children, that they would stay with Bernard. As Stephen says in my book, I just go with the wind, Hooky, I do.
Yeah.
And he is a follower rather than a leader. And he chose to stick with Barney, presumably, because he found Barney's company and vision for New Order more palatable. But I think Peter Hook doing what he did, he's got his band The Light, and he plays whole Joy Division albums and whole New Order albums with this band, and it all went into abeyance during lockdown. But of course, it's starting up again, and he's very much now the keeper of the catalogue. And that, of course, spurred New Order into action. I think they would have made another album, but they might not have done. But it was almost, I think, a response to that. And yes, they've included more Joy Division material in there. And that's certainly a response to what Peter Hook's doing. But it's also, I think, what they should be doing too, They've been at it for almost 40 years. There's a massive amount of music that New Order can and should be playing, and it doesn't mean, and I'm not suggesting this for 1 second, that they shouldn't make new music. Of course they should. New Order album, how exciting will that be? And it should, in theory, come this year. But let's wait until it appears.
There's a lot of famous bands breaking up, and I think it wasn't Wishbone Ash, but it was Barclay James Harvest, where there's two songwriters and they split, and they both call themselves Barclay James Harvest, and they do their own material. They don't do the other person's material, and you think, that's all right. Obviously the fans must be a bit irritated, but never mind, they have to cope with it. But with Peter Hook, it must be a little bit different, because obviously this isn't the music that he actually would have written, that he's kind of keeping the sort of the flame alive, really, is it?
No, well, everything he does is music that he co-wrote. Mustn't forget that. He's entitled to play that music. It's his music. Just as New Order under Bernard are entitled to play Joy Division and New Order music too. They're all, I think, entitled to do it. And I think there's certainly room for both, but they're operating on different scales. New Order, still an arena act, still keepers, not necessarily of the flame, but they are the mothership. Peter playing relatively smaller venues, not massively, not tiny venues, but certainly smaller venues. And he is keeping that old flame alive. He went out and played all of Movement before lockdown. Crikey! Obviously, you had to pad it out with stuff that people liked later on. But even Movement, which is seen as the runt of the New Order litter, going and seeing Peter Hook play that and rediscovering those songs. Maybe you hear it and think, yeah, that's not actually, it's all right. It's all right. Yes. That's good. And if you still don't think it's that good, then he'll play some greatest hits later in the show. And I don't think Peter Hook is really there to make new music as such. Whereas I think part of New Order's existence does involve new music.
Yes. And so what do you see the future? I mean, I know you've written a book about the past, but how do you sort of see them panning out? Or is it going to be this much of the same, just repeated for the next, until they die?
I don't know. There's obviously two scenarios. One is the one that you suggested, that they carry on and someone dies or is unable to carry on. But there's also the suggestion that, as I said before, these people, Peter and Barney, have known each other since childhood. There is still a sense, and still, I think, quite a big part of the New Order fan base who regards New Order as Peter, Barney, Gillian, and Stephen, irrespective of the fine contributions that the new guys, Phil and Tom, have done. And if that lineup were to reform for a tour particularly, and maybe even an album, then there would be something absolutely sensational about it. Maybe that would close the chapter. I don't know. But there are no signs of it. There's no signs of it at all at the moment, unless, there may have been secret talks going on. I have no idea. But yes. There's no news on the Manchester Tom-Toms of any kind of reconciliation, any suggestion that there's anything other than the bitterness. And it's incredibly sad, There's nothing, I mean, fractured friendships are sad, but after all that they've been through for decades, to use the title of my book, after all that, after the death that they've gone through, after the way that they built up after Ian died, after the enormous success that they fashioned together, after the deaths of Tony Wilson, after the death of their manager, Rob Gretton, after all that shared experience, which only they know, then to be in a position where they feel that they cannot speak to each other than through occasional communications through lawyers, that's desperately heartbreaking. And I can't think of anyone who wouldn't wish that situation to be somehow resolved. They both owe it to themselves, and they both owe it to each other, I think. Now, I also have a feeling that Bernard seems very, very happy in New Order. There's no suggestion it's any kind of democracy. It's one person's band now. And everyone in New Order understands that. And I think Bernard finds that much easier than the sort of competitive grit that Peter always brought with him. And maybe that New Order have been going so long and they're so secure that they don't need that anymore. They don't need competing visions. Maybe they just need one vision. And the amount of stress that Peter caused Bernard, and that it certainly wasn't one way, of course, but the amount of stress that Peter caused Bernard, I don't think he would want to repeat that, because he would have to invite Peter back into New Order.
Yes, and I'm sure that it's a bit like the Fleetwood Mac thing, when they were it's such a touchy kind of dynamic between the bands. And like you said, it was kind of interesting with a band like Motorhead, when they first started, the three of them, Lemmy and Phil Taylor, and also Fast Eddie. I think they all thought Motorhead was their band, and then eventually it was Lemmy's band, and the other two guys were just the sidekicks, and they all understood it. The dynamics were much more straightforward. No more problems. There was no more, it's going to be Lemmy's final say, and that's it. And I can see the difficulty of when a band has that democratic quality. But then bands like, though I didn't love U2, I mean, I thought they were okay, but I'm just so impressed that they managed to keep going at the level that they keep without it just getting unpleasant, a bit like New Order, because in a way, New Order could be the current.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, New Order. One rainy night when Joy Division were recording Closer in Islington, there was a knock at the door, and these 4 bedraggled Irish lads turned up at the studio, soaked to the skin, trying to get to see Peter or Bernard or even Martin Hannah, saying, "Look, could you listen to our tape, please? We love Joy Division." And this, of course, was U2. They were sent off with a flea in their ear, but I think they kept the tape. And there was a point where maybe Joy Division could have gone that U2 route. You never know. I don't think so. But you're right. Some bands can keep going and have some kind of equilibrium in their relationship, and you can see, whether you like U2 or not, you can see that they're all 4 of them are contributing and not pulling in different directions, and they seem to be accepted. They seem to have an acceptance of each other. When Bono goes off ranting, you see the others rolling their eyes, but it seems to be rolling their eyes with some sort of affection.
Yes.
And there was never a lot of affection in Joy Division or New Order. And when it came to sort of sarcasm, then it didn't seem to be underpinned by a loveliness at all. Yes. And maybe that took its toll over the years. But, very, very few bands can carry on in the way of U2. They're an absolute exception. I mean, Fleetwood Mac, who you mentioned, they don't count because they've gone through so many lineup changes, and when they got the classic lineup together, they still loathed each other and still couldn't deal with each other. But no one in Joy Division or New Order slept with anyone's wife or girlfriend.
No, this is true.
It didn't go that far. But maybe bands in their 4th decade just need a leader, although U2 fans would say, no, they don't. Look at us.
Yes. Do you think, this is not, it just reminds me of, because again, we're from this side looking out and thinking, my God, you only have to kind of occasionally just not say anything in the room, read the space, read the room, just be a bit more careful, especially with age. You kind of realise when to talk and when not to talk. But it's strange, and I wasn't sure if this is any connection, but, you had New Order and the Smiths, the hatred that those bands have within themselves, and especially the latter where, their legacy is kind of quite murky now. Is it a little bit of something that you find in sort of places like Manchester? That was my question, really. I never thought of that before, but it was kind of this kind of so unpleasant because there isn't affection, and there's still this kind of barbed unpleasantness between the members of, the 2 members of the Smiths and the vaguely others, and the same with Joy Division. You think, my God, guys, we're all getting old. Your our parents are all getting doddery. We're getting doddery. You get to a point where you just think, actually, I don't really care. Let's just kind of move on because we're not 20 anymore, and there's other things that in the world that are more important. And so I just wondered if you ever thought, God, what is it about some of these bands?
I don't know. I mean, to add to your argument, obviously you can bring Oasis into that, but I can't see any reason why it should be a Manchester thing. I think it's a band thing, and that you're with these people. You're the early stages of a band. You're with these people almost 24 hours a day when you're touring, and you're sleeping in the same van, in the same hotel room if you're lucky. You're sleeping in the same bed. Not in a sexual sense, of course.
No,
because you can't afford anything else. You're with them 24 hours a day, and there's a moment where you're so excited because you're climbing up the tree very, very slowly, and you'll put up with that for a bit. But it also means that you know everything about these people. There's no mystery, and those little annoyances, because you're with them for so long, they start to grate. It might be how they chew, it might be how they pronounce certain words. But if you're with someone 24 hours a day, and they're chewing or slurping, and you don't like that, it's going to fester. Yes. And then later, some, when it gets really big, sensible bands keep their space from each other. You often go interview major bands and say, do you socialise? They go, no, of course we don't socialise. Yes. One, we've socialised non-stop for 5 years, but now we live in different parts of the world, and that is better for the band. And of course it's better for the band.
Well,
yes. You have, the bands who can afford to, say, travel separately, have their separate lives as much as possible, only meet on stage. Some people think that's really false. It's not false at all. It's a way of keeping the band going and keeping in somebody's presence who isn't you.
Yeah, and also I think a lot of bands, when they've gone through that honeymoon period, which is often ends in divorce, look at it as actually this is a job now. And do you socialise with the people that you work with? No, you don't. Do you go on holiday with the people you work with? Definitely not. But you just look. but because doing this kind of this show for a long time, most bands, there's a 5-year narrative. They get, this is the 80s. They get together, they have that 12-month honeymoon. They do a few little gigs here and there, mostly in front of friends, family, anybody else they can emotionally blackmail to see them. Then the John Peel, play on with the single. Then the John Peel session, the first album, things are going well. Then the second, possibly third album, they've done the transit van around all the little art centres and possibly the university. But the thing that often finishes a band is the dynamic of 5 years being with each other 24/7, but also the incredible lack of money. So Joy Division is a bit different because they've had that period, but now they potentially have money, whereas most bands go, I'm more broke now than I was 5 years ago, and I hate you all. So, there isn't any, well, just keep your mouth shut and get, here's a paycheck for the last year. And you think, oh, okay, I'm not going to have to go and get a job somewhere else, am I? So I think it's kind of weird with, when a band like Joy Division kind of through that 80s period, hit a height 9 years later, then, I just kind of, they must, as you said, they'd had the 2, years with Joy Division. You think with all that experience and age, and you're getting into your 30s, not to sort of work out a few strategies to keep it going.
Yes, I don't think they saw it. I don't think they were self-aware enough to see that they might have, the two of them, Peter and Barney, might have individually contributed to the breakdown of their relationship. And drugs and drink don't help in that time. And there wasn't a financial imbalance. They're getting the same amount of publishing money. And eventually someone starts to feel frustrated about musical direction, about the amount of space there is for them in the band, and they become paranoid. And Peter, by his own admission, became very, very paranoid. He saw little slides in everything, and that made him impossible. And I see where you're coming from, because there should have been coping strategies, but not everyone is capable of doing it. Think about the very, very few bands have lasted the course with an unchanged lineup. Radiohead they're a brilliant example of that. They're a brilliant example of people who seem to have some sort of residual affection for each other and still do their separate things, don't rock the mothership, and keep going, in a roughly unified sort of way. And other bands, from another area, Def Leppard are a great example of that. They've had deaths and they've had tragedy in their career, and they do live in different continents for the most part, but they still know that they've got this thing to come back to, and they can still tolerate each other, that they still can give each other enough space. And, it's like if you catch them out travelling separately, you've not caught them out travelling separately. They're travelling separately to keep the band going.
Yes.
And I don't think New Order, I don't think Barney and Peter, I just don't think they ever got that. And also it's slightly complicated by having a couple in the band as well. And that, you've got 4 people, you have 3 hotel rooms, and there never seems to have been any great pressure on Stephen and Gillian's relationship. It seems very strong. They've had the children. She's had breast cancer. They've gone through a lot together, and they still seem incredibly solid. So you've got that unit, which is almost apart from the rest of the band and the band's dynamic. And that's very, very odd. It very rarely happens like that. I know you have couples in bands, but it
doesn't end well.
Yes, but that has not been the cause of it. I mean,
No.
I think he was very disrespectful about Gillian's musical abilities, and he felt let down by Stephen's behaviour when the split came. I think he expected Stephen to side with him much more than he did. Hence that comment that I said before. I blow with the wind. He thought Stephen might have been a bit stronger, but it's a very unusual band, and I know couples in bands don't work. If the couple split up, it splits the band up. But you have a feeling that if Gillian and Stephen had split up, it wouldn't have split New Order up.
Yes, this is true.
It'd been probably untenable for them both to stay in the band. But, Peter and Barney would have certainly continued without one of them. And now you would imagine that Barney would certainly continue. Although there seems no sign of it.
Yeah, and also I think with a few members, obviously, and I remember the other Manchester band that was quite interesting was James. I mean, they were sort of a pretty second division band in a way, and then they hit gold dust in the 90s, and they split up, and obviously all their solo projects weren't working, and they make that decision to sort of reform, and I get the feeling it's a bit like, we can't retire yet, and there's plan B on the financial front isn't going to be going very well. So shall we have a proper sit down and work out some strategies, because we can sell our greatest hits and do the odd new album, and we can keep this as a career. And I kind of, though it's a little bit cynical, I think I can understand it, because, let's face it, it's going to be a lot better than going to a job interview saying, what have you done for 20 years? It's like, I was a bass player in James. And it's like, any other Excel spreadsheets? It's like, so some bands do get that, quite quickly. And I think the Rolling Stones realised that their solo work was never going to sort of afford them the lifestyle that they would like, and got used to. So I think in a way, it is kind of interesting that some bands, I think, just can, they do it for the music and they do it for the creativity, but they also realise that, they're getting a bit old and they haven't got too many other life skills, really.
Yeah, I would imagine no one has a sit down quite like James, but I mean, yes, I think so. There is a bit of, what else can you do? You're right. If you live in a pop star world, you're even at a it's a medium level. Then it's not normal. It's not a normal existence. It's a very closeted, bubble-like existence, and even at a medium level, then people are telling you you're great all the time. And that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in the real world. It doesn't happen in our jobs. You don't get applauded for going into work.
No, you don't get. Yes, they get no feedback. So, having sat in your Ford Fiesta 1.3 on some sort of lay-by, I mean, was there something that you discovered from doing the book that you hadn't realised when you started the journey and process, which sort of made you think, oh wow, I hadn't sort of really contemplated that?
That's a very good question. I think what I'd underestimated was the level, and I shouldn't have done. I should have realised this very, very quickly. I think I underestimated the level of their ambition, and the fact that from Peter and Barney's point of view, nothing would stop them. But also Ian too. Ian is very much seen as this pure figure, this poetic soul. And I think in the book, in certain areas, I do portray him as that. And there's some truth to it. But Ian was phenomenally ambitious. And he was the one, as I said before, he's grabbed Tony Wilson by the lapels, but he was the one who was trying to get them to sign to a major label. He tried so hard. You tried everybody. There was an RCA office in Manchester at the time, and Ian was there almost every day, making friends, trying to get them to sign. And Ian's ambition for the music of Joy Division, it was world beating. He certainly, whatever problems were in his life, and whatever forced him to take his own life, it certainly wasn't because he was afraid of Joy Division being huge. He wanted desperately for Joy Division to be huge. Maybe on his own terms, I don't know. But to be honest, I don't think he was that picky. And that Ian would have embraced being incredibly successful. Now, I think clearly he'd had to change. He couldn't have changed his physical problems, but he couldn't keep writing lyrics at the level of intensity on Unknown Pleasures and Closer. But he would have developed, the great songwriters, Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, the people I keep mentioning, the people around for the long career that Ian, I think, thought he might have been destined for. They started from early anger or early despair, and they moved on. They embraced more adult topics, and I think Ian would certainly have done that. And I think he would have done an awful lot to keep selling records, to keep playing big venues. And I think it's important not to forget this. And I know very casually before I said that New Order became New Order and carried on after Ian's death because they didn't have anything else to do. But that doesn't mean that they weren't phenomenally ambitious. At every opportunity they took to sell more records, to play to larger crowds, they took. No, they didn't spurn anything. They were trying to do the ill-fated adverts for Sunkist, the orange soft drink. They didn't turn that down. A bit of money, a bit of exposure in America. Great. It didn't quite work out, but that's not the point.
Yes, and obviously at that point we sort of forget that in the 70s, all of the 70s, basically, it is a grim economic and political time really in the UK. There is an amazing lack of money, and even in the 80s with a lot of the bands I've interviewed, they were all sort of either unemployed or claiming job seekers allowance or enterprise allowance schemes, because it was almost like, well, there's nothing to do, or I could be in a band and have a year being, on the enterprise allowance scheme, as long as I've managed to find £1,000 in my bank account and put anything down. And so there was a sort of sense of desperation. I think I remember a few months ago, probably longer, listening to the great Bill Shankly talking about, where he grew up in Scotland. He said you had two choices: you either went down the pit or you played football. And I think with a lot of people, there was that element of like, you're either possibly going to get a rubbish job if you're lucky, or there is this one way out, which could be, music or football. But if you've, at a certain age, you missed the boat, haven't you, really? So I could imagine why a lot of those bands had a desperation to sort of work hard, get in the transit van, drive across the country, then pack up and unload at 4 a.m. and just keep doing it until something happened, because there wasn't that many kind of great highlights. You didn't go on the internet and sort of lose yourself on social media, did you? There wasn't that much. There weren't many alternatives around.
No, I mean, when Joy Division started, when they were called Warsaw, they were a pretty bog standard punk band, and they'd been galvanised by seeing the Sex Pistols. And I think musically, although Warsaw, as I said, were a bit of a punk band, then they weren't musically galvanised by the Sex Pistols. Seeing the Sex Pistols taught them that it was possible to do it. That all the bands that Peter Hook had taken Barney to see, your Deep Purples and Wishbone Ash, they seemed so remote. They were like people from another planet. The Sex Pistols came, and particularly the first round of gigs at the Free Trade Hall, then they were just ordinary blokes. They were like Cockney geezers, a bit like a London version of the future members of Joy Division themselves. And they saw the Sex Pistols and think, yeah, we can do this. We haven't really got any musical talent or anything like that, but we can form a band. And look, the Sex Pistols have come from London to play to us. Wow, how exciting is that? How sexy is that?
Yes.
And we can do this. And that, I think, although they certainly weren't politically interested, I mean, I think Ian voted Conservative, and they weren't moved even when they played. New Order played minor strike benefits, but they weren't bothered, frankly. It didn't seem like a labour of conviction or love from them.
They weren't part of the Red Wedge movement, were they?
No, they certainly weren't. They were putting their names to the cause, so we mustn't be too cynical. But they weren't political activists or anything. But it was, as you said, one way out. And they weren't coming from desperate poverty. You know, they were coming from lower middle class for the most part. Their upbringings were quite complicated in many ways, but they were working class lads. They're working class lads who would have thought that they'd been guaranteed clerical jobs like at Manchester to Shipping Company, yes, or wherever it was. They'd have been guaranteed that, but this was a way out. And lest we forget, they enjoyed it, you know.
Yes, absolutely. God, it's good. Oh, yeah, just last thing. I mean, one of the great things with Joy Division is the music, but it is also their photographic record. And one thing I noticed in the last year, that it can't be completely about lockdown, but a lot of people I'm looking over my bookshelf here, a lot of photographic books came out on the Texas punk scene, the scene which was in Boston, just up from New York. And yes, CBGBs. I mean, Joy Division did benefit from great photographic images, didn't they? From the great, from Kevin Cummins. This does help the band a huge amount, as well as the design of their album sleeves. So the two things are sort of married, aren't they, quite beautifully, because there is this great document of the band, seeing these kind of stark black and white images of them.
Well, I mean, Joy Division were a package. They were very well imaged. There was Peter Savile's artwork. It didn't include any members of Joy Division. So you'd no idea what they looked like. So therefore, when they did photo sessions, be it with Kevin Cummins or other photographers, then they were in a position to create their own mystique in that way. And they looked great. And if you could frame them in a Manchester background, then you had this visual image. But it was also, it was in contrast with, say, the cover to Unknown Pleasures, which is now, it's become a T-shirt.
Yes.
It's not an album sleeve anymore.
It's probably
It's T-shirt. And I would think there's people wearing it who have absolutely no idea what Joy Division or Unknown Pleasures are. And that's fair enough. I don't care. I wouldn't imagine members of New Order do, especially now they're getting paid, or they should be getting paid. And it does mean that they gave a fair amount of thought as to how they looked. But on stage, Ian Curtis never looked like a pop star. He dressed like a bank clerk. He dressed like his day job at Social Security.
Yes. Well, their fashion sense, I suppose, does highlight probably a lot of their kind of financial position as well, and not the world of fast disposable fashion, because it is very sort of ordinary, isn't it? But because the photographs are in black and white, it adds just a sense, shades of grey, really, isn't it? But there's kind of contrast with some bright lights, or the snow backseat, the backdrop of the snow and winter. It adds to that sort of romantic.
It does, yes, and New Order too. New Order, they were on the cover of Low Life, but they haven't gone for that record cover image. You turn up at a New Order concert, you really haven't got a clue what they're going to wear. You really don't know, and I think it makes it not part of it. In a sense, they're sort of imageless, and it on a purist level, it makes it more about the music. But I think that the lack of image enhances the music too. It means that if you get an album, say like Republic, which is one of the more interesting designs, I don't think by any means all New Order's design work has worked. Not like Joy Division, but partly because they've had so many more decades at it.
Yes.
And but it gives them this sort of facelessness and I mean that in a very positive way. That it's if Bernard is looking a lot older than he was in 1979, it doesn't really matter.
Yes, a little bit chubby. But I suppose the great thing with the Joy Division pictures in the book, which I think is so beautifully designed and put together, is the wallpaper in some of those gigs. I mean, they're quite mesmerising, the wallpaper shots, aren't they? With the, like, it's almost like those working men's clubs that we've been to many decades ago, where you just kind of can't take your eyes on some of the sort of decor and the sort of little bits and pieces that decorate it that have been around. And I think that's some of the genius of those photographs. Is just going, blimey, that's wallpaper, isn't it? They're just in a corner of a working man's club, aren't they? Yeah. This is brilliant.
Yes. Yeah, they're in the corner of a pub. They're playing on the stage is a carpet.
And on that bombshell, we'll say the end. Well, apart from the last little bit. Anyway, massive thank you to John for giving me the time for that interview, which, took place in 2022. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can on all those social media platform sites. All these fascinating interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Check them out. They might change your life. Have a great week. Stay safe.